The winter of 1893 brought more than just snow to Copper Ridge, Wyoming. It brought a chance encounter that would defy society's expectations and challenge the most powerful men in the territory. When millionaire cattle rancher William Harrison stepped off the evening train, he never imagined that a shivering Cherokee girl huddled in rags would become the woman who'd change his life forever. But some love stories are written in the stars, and others are forged in the fire of prejudice and persecution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through Copper Ridge like a blade forged in the heart of winter itself, carrying with it the promise of the harshest season the Wyoming Territory had seen in a generation. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, blanketing the sprawling cattle ranches that dotted the valley in a deceptive beauty that masked the brutal reality facing both man and beast. The temperature had dropped so low that the breath of horses formed clouds thick enough to obscure their riders, and even the hardiest cowboys spoke in hushed tones about the livestock they were losing to the cold. William Thomas Harrison stood at the window of his private railroad car, watching the familiar landscape of his empire pass by in the gathering dusk. At 32, he was one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi, his fortune built on vast cattle ranches that stretched across 3 states and mining interests that had proven as reliable as they were profitable. His reflection in the glass showed a man who carried his success with quiet confidence, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and gray eyes that missed little. Those eyes had seen him through negotiations with railroad barons, battles with rustlers, and the complex web of territorial politics that could make or break a man's fortune in a single season. But tonight, those same eyes carried a weariness that had nothing to do with business concerns. William had spent the past 2 weeks in Chicago, attending meetings with Eastern investors who spoke of his cattle as numbers on ledgers and his land as commodities to be divided and sold. The conversations had left him feeling strangely hollow, as if the very thing that had driven him to build his empire, love for the vast open spaces and the freedom they represented, was being slowly drained away by the relentless pursuit of greater profits. The train began to slow as it approached Copper Ridge Station, the familiar whistle echoing off the surrounding mountains. William gathered his leather satchel and wool overcoat, preparing to disembark into a world where he was known, respected, and envied in equal measure. His foreman, Jake Patterson, would be waiting with the ranch's best horses to escort him home to the sprawling house that sat like a crown jewel at the center of his 20,000-acre spread. There would be reports to review, decisions to make, and the endless responsibilities that came with employing over 100 men and their families. As the train shuddered to a halt, William made his way through the ornate passenger car that served as his mobile office during long journeys. The furnishings were expensive but practical, rich leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and shelves lined with books on animal husbandry, land management, and territorial law. It was the car of a man who had earned his wealth through intelligence and determination rather than inheritance, though few people knew the full story of how a blacksmith's son from Ohio had become one of the most powerful ranchers in the American West. The station platform was nearly deserted when William stepped down from his car, the late hour and bitter cold having driven most travelers to seek shelter indoors. Gas lamps flickered in the wind, casting dancing shadows across the wooden planks that were already covered with a thin layer of fresh snow. He could see Jake Patterson waiting near the station house, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from 3 decades of working cattle in unpredictable weather. "Mr. Harrison," Jake called, his breath forming clouds as he spoke, "glad to see you made it back safe. We've got problems at the North Pasture Loss near 40. Head to the cold already, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better." William nodded grimly, his mind already shifting to the practical concerns that dominated ranch life during harsh winters. 40 head represented a significant financial loss, but more importantly, it signaled that the weather was severe enough to threaten the survival of his entire herd if proper precautions weren't taken immediately. Have you moved the cattle to the lower pastures? The windbreak should provide some protection. Already done, Jake replied, leading the way toward 2 horses that stood stamping impatiently in the cold. But Mr. Harrison, there's something else. Something you need to know before we head back to the ranch. There was something in Jake's tone that made William pause, his hand resting on his horse's reins. In the 3 years since Jake had become his foreman, the older man had never shown uncertainty when it came to ranch business. He was a straight-talking cowboy who dealt with problems as directly as he dealt with ornery cattle head-on and without hesitation. What is it, Jake? Well, sir, it's about the Cherokee situation down in Oklahoma Territory. You know how the government's been putting pressure on the tribes, forcing them off their lands and onto reservations? William's expression darkened. He had followed the news reports about the ongoing conflicts between federal authorities and various Native American tribes, though the issues had seemed distant from his day-to-day concerns in Wyoming. The policies of forced relocation and cultural suppression struck him as both morally questionable and practically short-sighted. But he had assumed these were problems that primarily affected tribes hundreds of miles to the south. What does that have to do with us? Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the station house before returning to William's face. Some of them Cherokee folks, they've been running north, trying to escape the soldiers and the reservation agents. Word is they're looking for places to hide, places where they can live free like their ancestors did. And some of them, well, they've been showing up around here. The implications of Jake's words began to sink in. The Wyoming Territory, with its vast open spaces and relatively sparse population, would naturally attract people seeking to escape the increasing government control over Native American populations. But the presence of Cherokee refugees would also create complex political and social problems for anyone who chose to help them. How many are we talking about? Hard to say for certain, Jake replied. Most of them keep moving, afraid to stay in one place too long. But the townspeople are getting nervous, especially after what happened over in Medicine Bow last month. William had heard rumors about the incident in Medicine Bow, a confrontation between local authorities and a group of Native Americans that had ended in violence and arrests. The details had been unclear, filtered through newspaper accounts that seemed more interested in sensationalism than accuracy. But the general message had been unmistakable. The federal government was cracking down hard on any tribes that refused to accept relocation to designated reservations. Jake, I appreciate you keeping me informed, but I'm not sure what you expect me to do about the situation. We run cattle, not a sanctuary for displaced people. Even as he spoke the words, William felt uncomfortable with their callousness. His own family had immigrated to America seeking freedom and opportunity, and the idea of people being driven from their ancestral homes by government force struck him as fundamentally wrong. But he also understood the practical realities of his position. Any rancher who was perceived as harboring fugitive Native Americans would face severe consequences from federal authorities. Jake's next words, however, would make the situation far more personal than William could have imagined. Sir, there's something else. Something I probably should have mentioned in my telegram, but I wasn't sure how to put it in writing. Jake paused, seeming to gather his courage. There's a girl, Mr. Harrison. Cherokee girl, couldn't be more than 18 or 19 years old. She's been hanging around the train station for the past 2 days, sleeping rough and looking like she hasn't had a decent meal in weeks. William felt a strange tightening in his chest, though he couldn't immediately understand why the mention of a single displaced person should affect him more than the broader political situation. What about the station master? Surely he's tried to help her or at least contact the authorities. That's just it, sir. Station Master Collins says she won't talk to him, won't accept help, won't even tell him her name. She just sits there in the cold, watching every train that comes through like she's waiting for someone who ain't never going to show up. Collins is worried she's going to freeze to death if this weather keeps up, but he doesn't know what to do about it. The wind gusted across the platform, sending snow swirling around the two men and their horses. William pulled his coat tighter against the cold, but his thoughts were no longer focused on his own comfort. Instead, he found himself imagining a young woman alone in this brutal weather, separated from everything familiar and facing an uncertain future with nothing but stubborn pride to sustain her. Where is she now? Jake pointed toward the far end of the platform, where the shadows cast by the station house created a pocket of darkness that the gas lamps couldn't penetrate. Last I saw, she was huddled up against the wall over there, trying to stay out of the wind. But Mr. Harrison, I have to warn you, approaching her might not be wise. There's already talk in town about Cherokee troublemakers, and if people see you getting involved. William understood the warning, but something stronger than caution was driving him forward. Perhaps it was the memory of his own family struggles when they had first arrived in America, or perhaps it was simply the basic human decency that his father had instilled in him despite their own poverty. Whatever the motivation, he found himself walking toward the dark corner of the platform, leaving Jake and the horses behind. As he drew closer, William could make out a small figure pressed against the wooden wall of the station house. She was wrapped in what appeared to be a tattered blanket, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders and her knees, drawn up to her chest in an attempt to conserve body heat. Even in the dim light, he could see that she was shivering uncontrollably, her entire body trembling with the effort of fighting off the cold that threatened to overcome her completely. For a moment, William hesitated. Jake's warning echoed in his mind, along with all the practical reasons why getting involved in this situation would be complicated and potentially dangerous. He was a businessman, not a crusader for social justice. His responsibilities were to his ranch, his employees, and the investors who had trusted him with their money. A smart man would walk away, return to his comfortable house, and let others deal with the problems of displaced Cherokee refugees. But as he stood there in the falling snow, watching a young woman slowly freeze to death, just yards away from warmth and safety, William realized that some decisions couldn't be made based purely on practical considerations. Some moments demanded that a person choose between what was safe and what was right, between protecting their own interests and protecting the fundamental dignity of another human being. He took another step forward, close enough now to see the girl's face clearly for the first time. She was younger than Jake had estimated, probably no more than 17, with the kind of delicate features that spoke of Cherokee heritage, mixed with something else, perhaps Spanish or French, remnants of the complex history that had shaped the American frontier. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was shallow and irregular, suggesting that hypothermia was beginning to take hold. "Miss?" William said softly, not wanting to startle her, but knowing that immediate action was necessary if she was going to survive the night. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on him with obvious difficulty. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Please go away. I don't want trouble." The words were spoken in English, but with the slight accent that suggested it wasn't her first language. Despite her obvious distress, there was a dignity in her bearing that reminded William of his own mother, a woman who had faced poverty and discrimination with quiet strength and unwavering pride. "I'm not here to cause trouble," William replied, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "But you're going to freeze to death if you stay out here much longer. When did you last have something warm to eat?" The girl's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he could see her fighting the urge to accept help from a stranger. I can take care of myself. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. William believed her. Everything about her demeanor suggested a person who had learned to rely on her own resources, who had faced hardships that would have broken someone with less inner strength. But self-reliance could only carry a person so far when facing the brutal realities of a Wyoming winter. "I'm sure you can," he said respectfully. "But even the strongest person needs shelter from weather like this. There's a hotel in town, or, if you prefer, my ranch has guest quarters where you could warm up and get a decent meal." "Your ranch?" The girl's expression shifted, becoming even more wary. "You're one of the big landowners around here?" William nodded, sensing that his wealth might actually work against him in this situation. To someone who had been driven from her own land by powerful men with government backing, a rich rancher might seem like just another threat rather than a potential ally. "My name is William Harrison. I own the Circle H Ranch about 10 miles north of town. And you are?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. William could see her weighing her options, calculating whether trusting a stranger represented a greater risk than continuing to face the elements alone. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she spoke. "My name is Running Moon, but most white people call me Sarah ... Sarah Lightfoot." The name carried weight, suggesting both her Cherokee heritage and the way she had been forced to adapt to a world that insisted on reshaping her identity to fit its own expectations. William felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty of a system that forced people to abandon their own names in order to be accepted by society. "Sarah," he said, testing the name she had offered, while silently wondering what stories lay behind her reluctance to use her Cherokee name. "I give you my word that you'll be safe at my ranch. No one will ask questions you don't want to answer, and you can leave whenever you choose." Sarah studied his face in the flickering gaslight, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. William found himself holding his breath, waiting for her decision and surprised by how much it mattered to him. In the space of a few minutes, this shivering girl had somehow become important to him in a way he couldn't fully understand. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you help someone like me? Don't you know what people will say?" The question cut to the heart of everything William had been thinking since Jake first mentioned the Cherokee refugees. He did know what people would say. He understood the social and political costs of getting involved in a situation that most of his peers would prefer to ignore. But standing there in the snow, looking into the eyes of someone who had clearly endured more hardship than anyone her age should have to face, those concerns seemed suddenly insignificant. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because no one should have to face this kind of weather alone." Sarah continued to study him for another long moment, then slowly began to struggle to her feet. William started to offer his assistance, but something in her expression warned him that she needed to maintain her independence, even in accepting help. When she finally stood, he could see that she was taller than he had initially thought, with the kind of graceful bearing that suggested she had been raised in a culture that valued dignity and self-possession. "If I come with you," she said carefully, "it's just until the weather clears. I won't be a burden on your hospitality longer than necessary." William nodded, understanding that this condition was important to her sense of self-respect. "Of course, though you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." As they walked back toward where Jake waited with the horses, William couldn't shake the feeling that this moment represented a turning point in his life, though he had no way of predicting where the path would lead. All he knew was that finding Sarah Lightfoot at the train station had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and property lines. Jake's expression was carefully neutral as they approached, but William could read the concern in his foreman's eyes. Taking in a Cherokee refugee was exactly the kind of decision that could have far-reaching consequences. especially if federal authorities or local vigilantes decided to make an issue of it. "Jake," William said formally, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Lightfoot. She'd be staying at the ranch as our guest until the weather improves." "Ma'am," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. If he had opinions about William's decision, he kept them to himself. As they prepared to mount their horses for the ride to the ranch, William found himself wondering what he had set in motion by offering sanctuary to a stranger. The practical part of his mind warned him that he was taking unnecessary risks, potentially jeopardizing everything he had worked to build. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for too long, whispered that some risks were worth taking. The snow continued to fall as they rode into the darkness, three figures moving through a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Behind them, the lights of Copper Ridge Station grew smaller and finally disappeared entirely, leaving them alone with the wind and the vast Wyoming night. None of them could have imagined that this simple act of compassion would soon set off a chain of events that would challenge the most powerful men in the territory and ultimately change the course of two lives forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Circle H ranch house rose from the snowy landscape like a fortress of warmth and prosperity, its stone foundation and timber frame designed to withstand the harshest Wyoming winters. Gas lamps blazed in every window, casting golden rectangles of light across the pristine snow that surrounded the main building. As their horses approached the circular drive, Sarah Lightfoot felt a mixture of awe and unease at the obvious wealth displayed before her. The house was larger than some of the government buildings she had seen, with wraparound porches, elaborate woodwork, and chimneys that promised the kind of warmth she hadn't experienced in weeks. William Harrison noticed her reaction and felt a stab of self-consciousness about the contrast between his comfortable circumstances and her obvious deprivation. "It's warmer than it looks from the outside," he said quietly, attempting to put her at ease. Sarah nodded, but said nothing, her dark eyes taking in details that spoke of a life so different from her own that it might as well have existed on another planet. The carefully manicured grounds, the expensive horses in the nearby corrals, the solid construction that represented permanence and security, everything about the Circle H spoke of the kind of stability that had been stripped away from her people through broken treaties and government force. As they dismounted, the front door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. Margaret O'Brien had served as William's housekeeper for nearly 5 years, and in that time she had learned to read her employer's moods and motivations with uncanny accuracy. The fact that he was arriving home after midnight with an unexpected guest told her immediately that this was no ordinary social visit. "Mr. Harrison," Margaret said warmly, though her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with obvious curiosity, "we weren't expecting you until tomorrow. I'll have your room ready in just a few minutes." "Thank you, Margaret. But first I'd like you to prepare the guest room in the East Wing. Miss Lightfoot will be staying with us until the weather improves." William's tone was carefully neutral, but Margaret caught the subtle emphasis that indicated this was not a request for debate. "Of course, sir, Miss Lightfoot. Welcome to the Circle H." Margaret's greeting was genuinely warm, though Sarah could see the questions lurking behind her polite smile. "You must be frozen through. Why don't you come inside while I prepare a hot bath and something warm to eat?" Sarah hesitated at the threshold, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of accepting hospitality from people she didn't know. The house smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something delicious that reminded her of her grandmother's cooking before the soldiers came. But it also smelled of wealth and privilege scents that had become associated in her mind with the men who had stolen her family's land and scattered her people to the winds. "I don't want to be any trouble," she said softly, her pride warring with her desperate need for warmth and safety. William stepped beside her, careful not to touch her but offering his presence as reassurance. "You're not trouble, Sarah. You're a guest, and guests are always welcome at the Circle H." The simple sincerity in his voice convinced her to cross the threshold into a world that seemed to exist in direct opposition to everything she had experienced over the past months. The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior, with polished hardwood floors, expensive rugs, and furniture that spoke of both comfort and quality. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its flames casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and artwork that depicted the American West in all its untamed glory. "Margaret," William said, removing his coat and hat, "could you also send word to Dr. Reynolds? I'd like him to take a look at Miss Lightfoot when he has a chance, just to make sure she hasn't suffered any lasting effects from exposure to the cold." Sarah stiffened at the suggestion, her wariness immediately returning. "I don't need a doctor. I'm fine." "I'm sure you are," William replied diplomatically. "But humor me. Dr. Reynolds is discreet and professional, and it would put my mind at ease to know you're completely healthy." The implication that her health mattered to him surprised Sarah, though she tried not to show it. In her experience, wealthy white men typically viewed Cherokee women as either threats to be eliminated or property to be exploited. The idea that one might genuinely care about her welfare was so foreign that she wasn't sure how to respond. Margaret, sensing the tension, intervened with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to managing delicate social situations. "Miss Lightfoot, why don't I show you to your room so you can get cleaned up and warm? Dr. Reynolds can wait until tomorrow if you prefer. Right now, the most important thing is getting you comfortable." Sarah followed Margaret up a sweeping staircase that led to the second floor of the house, her boots silent on the thick carpet that covered the steps. The East Wing guest room was larger than the cabin where she had spent her childhood, with a four-poster bed, a writing desk, and windows that looked out over the ranch's sprawling pastures. But what captured her attention immediately was the fireplace, already crackling with freshly laid logs that filled the room with blessed warmth. "The bathroom is through that door," Margaret explained, indicating a doorway that led to what Sarah would later discover was a fully modern facility with running water and electric lighting. "I'll bring up some clean clothes and something hot to eat. Is there anything specific you'd prefer?" Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding her and uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar social terrain. "Anything would be fine. I'm grateful for whatever you can spare." Margaret's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Child, you don't need to be grateful for common decency. Mr. Harrison may be wealthy, but he was raised to believe that hospitality is a moral obligation, not a favor to be repaid." After Margaret left, Sarah stood alone in the guest room, trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. Just hours earlier, she had been preparing to face another night of exposure to the brutal Wyoming cold, uncertain whether she would survive until morning. Now she found herself in surroundings that rivaled anything she had seen during her brief time in government schools, surrounded by comfort and safety that seemed almost too good to be true. The hot bath that Margaret prepared was a revelation in itself. Sarah had grown accustomed to washing in ice-cold streams and melted snow, so the luxury of sinking into warm water felt like a miracle. As she soaked away weeks of accumulated grime and exhaustion, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to live without constant fear and uncertainty. But even as she enjoyed this temporary respite, darker thoughts intruded. Sarah had learned through bitter experience that kindness from strangers often came with expectations or hidden costs. White men, in particular, had proven capable of breathtaking cruelty disguised as benevolence. She would accept William Harrison's hospitality because the alternative was death by freezing. But she would not allow herself to trust him completely. Downstairs, William stood before his study fireplace, staring into the flames and contemplating the implications of his impulsive decision to bring Sarah home. Jake Patterson had remained diplomatically silent during the ride from town, but William could sense his foreman's concern about the potential complications that might arise from harboring a Cherokee refugee. "Mr. Harrison?" Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "I've gotten Miss Lightfoot settled for the night, but I think there are some things you should know." William turned from the fireplace, noting the serious tone in his housekeeper's voice. "What is it, Margaret?" "That girl has been through something terrible, sir. I've seen enough hardship in my life to recognize the signs, and what I saw when I helped her into that bath. Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's got scars, Mr. Harrison, old ones and some that look more recent. And she's too thin, like someone who's been going without regular meals for a long time." William felt a cold anger building in his chest as he processed Margaret's observations. "What kind of scars?" "The kind that come from violence, sir. Some look like they might be from a whip or switch. Others could be from rough handling or worse. And there's something else. She keeps looking toward the windows like she's expecting trouble to come riding up at any moment." The housekeeper's words confirmed William's growing suspicion that Sarah's presence at the train station hadn't been a matter of simple displacement. She was running from something specific, something that had left both physical and emotional wounds that would take time to heal. "Margaret, I want you to make sure she understands that she's safe here. Whatever happened to her before, it won't happen again under my roof." "I believe you mean that, Mr. Harrison, but meaning it and making it true are two different things. That girl has learned not to trust easily, and I suspect she has good reasons for her caution." Before William could respond, Jake Patterson appeared in the study doorway, his hat in his hands and his expression grim. "Mr. Harrison, I hate to interrupt, but we've got a problem brewing in town." William's stomach tightened with apprehension. "What kind of problem?" "Word's already gotten out about you bringing the Cherokee girl to the ranch. Collins at the train station apparently told his wife, who mentioned it to Mrs. Fletcher at the general store, and you know how fast news travels in a town this size." William cursed silently, though he had expected this development. Copper Ridge was too small for secrets, especially ones involving controversial subjects like Native American refugees. "What's the general reaction?" "Mixed, sir. Some folks are saying you did the Christian thing, helping someone in need. But others are worried about setting a precedent, encouraging more Cherokee to come north looking for sanctuary. And there's a third group that's more concerned about federal authorities taking notice of our town." The political ramifications of his decision were beginning to crystallize in William's mind. The federal government had made it clear that harboring Cherokee refugees was considered obstruction of official policy, potentially subject to criminal prosecution. Local communities that gained reputations as sanctuaries for displaced Native Americans often found themselves under increased federal scrutiny, with economic and legal consequences that could devastate small towns. "Who's leading the opposition?" Jake's expression grew even more troubled. "That would be Councilman Porter and his supporters. They're talking about calling a town meeting to discuss the situation, maybe even petitioning the territorial governor to send federal marshals to investigate." William knew Benjamin Porter well, a local politician whose ambitions extended far beyond Copper Ridge and who had built his reputation on rigid adherence to federal policies, regardless of their moral implications. Porter had always resented William's wealth and influence, seeing them as obstacles to his own political advancement. The opportunity to challenge the territory's most successful rancher on a matter of federal law would be irresistible to a man like Porter. "When is this town meeting supposed to take place?" "Day after tomorrow, assuming the weather clears enough for folks to travel safely." "But Mr. Harrison, there's something else you need to know. Porter's been in contact with federal authorities about the Cherokee situation in general. He's positioning himself as a loyal supporter of government policy, and having you harbor a refugee plays right into his hands. The implications of Jake's words sent a chill through William that had nothing to do with the winter weather. If Porter could frame the situation as a case of a wealthy rancher flouting federal law, it might provide him with the political ammunition needed to challenge William's position in the community and potentially bring down federal pressure on the entire region. Jake, I want you to quietly spread the word among our supporters that I'll be attending this town meeting. Make it clear that anyone who questions my decision to provide temporary shelter to someone in need can address their concerns to me directly. Yes, sir. But Mr. Harrison, are you sure this is a battle you want to fight? There might be easier ways to handle the situation. William understood what Jake was suggesting, that he could quietly arrange for Sarah to be moved somewhere else, removing the immediate source of controversy and allowing the political storm to blow over. It was the practical solution, the one that would protect his business interests and maintain his standing in the community. But as he thought about the young woman upstairs, recovering from exposure and trauma in the safety of his guest room, William realized that some principles were more important than political expedience. Sarah Lightfoot had already suffered enough at the hands of people who valued policy over human dignity. He would not add to her suffering by abandoning her when she needed protection most. No, Jake, this is exactly the battle I want to fight, and I intend to win it. Upstairs, Sarah lay in the comfortable guest bed, listening to the muffled voices drifting up from William's study. She couldn't make out the specific words, but the tone of the conversation was enough to confirm her suspicions that her presence at the Circle H Ranch was already creating problems for her host. The clean nightgown that Margaret had provided was softer than anything Sarah had worn since childhood, and the warm blanket surrounding her represented a luxury she had almost forgotten existed. But comfort couldn't silence the voice in her head that warned against becoming too attached to temporary safety. She had learned, through experiences too painful to fully remember, that sanctuary offered by white men often came with conditions that weren't immediately apparent. Sometimes those conditions were financial, sometimes they were physical, and sometimes they involved betrayals that cut deeper than any physical wound. Whatever William Harrison's motivations for helping her, Sarah was determined to remain vigilant and ready to run if necessary. But as she drifted towards sleep for the first time in weeks without fear of freezing to death, she couldn't help but wonder if this time might be different. The kindness she had seen in William's eyes seemed genuine, and Margaret's maternal concern felt authentic rather than calculated. Perhaps, just perhaps, there were still people in the world who helped others simply because it was the right thing to do. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the Wyoming landscape, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. But inside the Circle H ranch house, Sarah Lightfoot slept peacefully for the first time, since soldiers had burned her family's cabin and scattered her people to the winds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she was warm, safe, and alive. For now, that was enough. Dawn broke over the Circle H ranch with a crystalline clarity that transformed this snow-covered landscape into a wonderland of glittering white perfection. Sarah Lightfoot woke to sunlight streaming through windows that faced east toward the distant mountains. Her body rested for the first time in months, but her mind immediately alert to potential dangers. The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike in the bright morning light. The encounter at the train station, the ride through the snow, the overwhelming luxury of the ranch house that had provided her sanctuary. She dressed quickly in the clothes Margaret had left for her, a simple but well-made brown wool dress that fit surprisingly well, warm stockings, and sturdy boots that would protect her feet from the cold. The garments were clearly expensive, though not ostentatious, and Sarah found herself wondering about their origin. Had they belonged to a previous guest, or did William Harrison keep women's clothing on hand for unexpected situations like this? The question troubled her more than she wanted to admit, suggesting possibilities about her host's character that she preferred not to contemplate. But as she made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon that promised a breakfast, more substantial than any meal she had eaten in recent memory, Sarah reminded herself that survival sometimes required accepting help without fully understanding the giver's motivations. The kitchen of the Circle H was a revelation in itself, large enough to feed a small army, with modern conveniences that spoke of both wealth and practicality. Margaret O'Brien stood at a massive cast-iron stove, her movements efficient and purposeful as she prepared what appeared to be enough food for a dozen people. She looked up with a warm smile as Sarah entered, though her experienced eyes noted the way the young woman positioned herself near the door, ready for quick escape if necessary. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. Mr. Harrison is already out checking on the cattle, but he left instructions that you should eat as much as you want and make yourself comfortable." "Coffee?" Sarah nodded gratefully, accepting the cup of steaming coffee that Margaret poured from a pot that looked like it could service a small restaurant. The first sip was pure luxury, rich, hot, and strong enough to chase away the lingering effects of too many cold nights. "The clothes fit well," Margaret observed, ladling eggs and bacon onto a plate that she set before Sarah at the large wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen. "I thought they might. They belonged to Mr. Harrison's sister, Rebecca. She visited last summer and left several dresses behind." The explanation should have been reassuring, but something in Margaret's tone suggested there was more to the story. Sarah had learned to read people carefully during her months of running and hiding, and she sensed that the housekeeper was choosing her words with deliberate care. "Does she visit often?" Sarah asked, testing the waters. Margaret's expression grew carefully neutral. "Rebecca lives in San Francisco now. She's married to a banker there, quite prosperous by all accounts. This was her first visit since Mr. Harrison bought the ranch, and it didn't go entirely well." The housekeeper's reluctance to elaborate was telling, but Sarah didn't press for details. Every family had its complications, and she had learned that prying into other people's secrets often revealed more than she wanted to know about her own precarious situation. As she ate the first substantial meal she had enjoyed in weeks, Sarah found herself studying the kitchen with professional interest. Her grandmother had taught her to cook for large groups during the seasonal gatherings that had once brought Cherokee families together from across the territory. The skills were still there, dormant but not forgotten, and she could see ways that the Circle H kitchen could be made even more efficient with some minor adjustments. "Margaret," she said carefully, "would it be possible for me to help with the cooking while I'm here? I don't want to be idle, and I have some experience feeding large groups." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose with surprise and what might have been relief. "That would be wonderful, dear. Feeding the ranch hands is no small task, especially during winter when they need extra calories to stay warm. But are you sure you're feeling up to that kind of work?" "I'm stronger than I look," Sarah replied, and Margaret could hear the steel beneath the quiet words. This young woman had survived things that would have broken others, and she was determined to contribute rather than simply accept charity. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house at speed. Margaret moved to the window, her expression growing concerned as she watched 3 riders dismount and stride purposefully toward the front door. "Sarah, dear, perhaps you should go upstairs for a few minutes. These men don't look like they're here for a social call." But Sarah was already moving toward the back of the kitchen, her instincts honed by months of avoiding unwanted attention. She positioned herself where she could hear the conversation that was about to take place while remaining hidden from view. The voices that soon filled the front hallway confirmed her worst fears. "Mrs. O'Brien, we need to speak with Mr. Harrison immediately. This is official business." The speaker was a man with the clipped tones of federal authority, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice at the implications. Mr. Harrison is out checking on the livestock, sir. The storm caused some damage, and he's assessing the situation. Perhaps you could come back later when he's available? I'm afraid this can't wait. I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson, and these are my associates. We're here about reports of Cherokee refugees in the area. Specifically, we understand that Mr. Harrison may be harboring an individual who should be on a federal reservation. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her presence at the Circle H had been reported to federal authorities faster than anyone could have anticipated. Someone in Copper Ridge had moved quickly to involve the law, and now her sanctuary was about to become a trap. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret replied with admirable composure. Mr. Harrison occasionally has guests, but he doesn't discuss his private affairs with the household staff. Mrs. O'Brien, obstruction of a federal investigation is a serious crime. We have reliable information that a Cherokee woman was brought to this ranch last night. If you're concealing her whereabouts, you could face prosecution along with your employer. The threat in the deputy marshal's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that she had put not only William, but also Margaret at risk by accepting their help. The knowledge filled her with guilt and a familiar rage at the way federal authorities used intimidation to enforce policies that tore families apart and destroyed lives. She was about to step forward and surrender herself when the sound of approaching horses announced William's return from his inspection of the ranch. Sarah heard him enter through the front door, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Gentlemen, I'm William Harrison. I understand you want to speak with me about something." "Mr. Harrison, I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson. We're investigating reports that you're harboring a Cherokee refugee on your property. Such actions constitute interference with federal policy and could result in serious legal consequences." There was a pause before William responded, and Sarah could imagine him studying the three men with the calculating gaze she had seen him use the night before. When he spoke, his voice carried no trace of intimidation or uncertainty. "Deputy Marshal, I assume you have warrants for this search? Because if you're here to ransack my property based on rumors and gossip, I'll need to see proper legal documentation." "Mr. Harrison, we're not here to search your property. We're here to give you an opportunity to cooperate voluntarily with federal authorities. If you're harboring Cherokee refugees, you can avoid prosecution by turning them over immediately. And if I'm not harboring anyone? If these reports you've received are based on misunderstandings or deliberate misinformation designed to cause me trouble?" Sarah could hear the tension building in the conversation, and she realized that William was buying time while he assessed the situation. But she also understood that his position was becoming more precarious with every passing moment. Federal marshals didn't make social calls, and their presence at the Circle H meant that powerful people were taking an interest in her situation. "Mr. Harrison," a new voice interjected, "perhaps we can resolve this simply. I'm Agent Crawford from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Our records show that a Cherokee woman named Running Moon, also known as Sarah Lightfoot, escaped federal custody 3 weeks ago near the Oklahoma border. She's wanted for questioning in connection with several incidents of resistance to relocation orders." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She wasn't just a refugee seeking shelter, according to federal authorities. She was a fugitive from justice. The distinction would make harboring her a much more serious crime, potentially subjecting William to prosecution for aiding and abetting a federal fugitive. "Agent Crawford," William's voice remained steady, "I'm curious about these incidents of resistance you mentioned. What exactly is this woman accused of doing?" "She's suspected of participating in armed resistance to federal agents, destroying government property, and inciting other Cherokee to violate relocation orders. These are serious charges, Mr. Harrison, and anyone who helps her avoid justice will be held accountable." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the events that had led to her flight from Oklahoma Territory. The armed resistance had been 3 Cherokee men defending their families from soldiers who had come to burn their homes. The destroyed government property had been a supply wagon that caught fire during the chaos. And the incitement had been her efforts to help elderly tribal members and children escape the violence that erupted when federal agents tried to force them onto wagons bound for the reservation. She had done nothing that violated her own moral code, but she understood that federal law made no distinction between justified self-defense and criminal violence when it came to Native Americans who resisted government policies. In the eyes of the law, she was a dangerous fugitive who deserved punishment rather than sanctuary. "Gentlemen," William said after a long pause, "I appreciate you sharing this information with me. However, I can't help you locate someone I've never met. If this woman is in the area, she hasn't sought assistance from me." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Sarah could hear the risk William was taking by offering it. Lying to federal agents was itself a crime, and if they discovered the truth, his legal situation would become exponentially worse. "Mr. Harrison," Deputy Marshal Thompson's voice carried a warning tone, "we're going to be conducting a thorough investigation of this entire region. If we discover that you've been less than truthful with us today, the consequences will be severe. The federal government takes Cherokee resistance very seriously, and we have broad authority to deal with anyone who aids fugitives." "I understand completely, Deputy Marshal. You have a job to do, and I respect that. But I also have rights as a property owner and a citizen of this territory. Unless you have warrants, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my land." The confrontation that followed was brief but tense, with the federal agents making it clear that they would be watching the Circle H Ranch closely, and that any suspicious activity would result in immediate legal action. Sarah remained hidden until she heard their horses departing, then emerged from the kitchen to find William standing in the hallway, his expression grim but determined. "You heard all of that?" he asked without preamble. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with guilt and fear. "I should leave immediately. I've put you in an impossible position, and staying here will only make things worse." "Where would you go?" William asked practically. "It's still below freezing outside. The federal agents will be watching the roads. And you have no money or supplies. Running now would be suicide." "But if they find me here—" "They won't find you here," William interrupted with quiet certainty. "The Circle H Ranch covers 20,000 acres, most of it wilderness that even the federal government can't search effectively. There are places you can hide safely while we figure out a permanent solution." Sarah stared at him, struggling to understand why he would continue helping her now that he knew the full extent of the legal risks involved. "Why? Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" William was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes focused on something beyond the immediate situation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal conviction that came from deep-held principles. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent while injustice is committed in their name. Because the Cherokee people have legitimate treaties that were broken whenever it became convenient for the government to break them. And because," he paused, meeting her eyes directly, "I believe that some things are more important than legal technicalities or personal safety. The honesty." In his voice convinced Sarah that his motivations were genuine, but it also filled her with a new kind of fear. William Harrison was risking everything, his wealth, his freedom, possibly his life, to protect her. The weight of that responsibility was almost more than she could bear. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something the agents didn't mention, but something you need to know before you make any final decisions about helping me." William waited patiently, and Sarah found herself preparing to reveal the truth that had driven her to flee Oklahoma Territory. A truth that would make her an even more valuable target for federal authorities and an even more dangerous guest for anyone brave enough to offer her sanctuary. "Agent Crawford was right about the resistance, but he didn't tell you everything. I wasn't just a participant, I was one of the leaders. And the people we helped escape? They're not on any reservation. They're hidden in places where the government will never find them, and they're organizing other Cherokee to resist relocation orders. The implications of her revelation hung between them like a loaded gun. Sarah Lightfoot wasn't just a refugee from federal persecution. She was a key figure in an organized resistance movement that posed a direct threat to government policy. Harboring her wasn't just an act of compassion. It was an act of rebellion that could bring down the full force of federal authority on anyone foolish enough to help her. William studied her face for a long moment, then surprised her by smiling slightly. "Sarah, I think you've just made this situation a lot more interesting." The news of federal agents visiting the Circle H Ranch spread through Copper Ridge faster than wildfire in dry grass. By noon, William Harrison found himself fielding visitors who arrived under various pretexts, but with the same underlying purpose to gauge his reaction to federal scrutiny and determine where he stood in the growing controversy surrounding Cherokee refugees. Some came as genuine friends expressing concern for his welfare, others as political opponents seeking signs of weakness they could exploit. Benjamin Porter arrived just after lunch, his timing calculated to coincide with the hour when most ranch hands would be visible around the main buildings. The councilman rode with two companions, both prominent local businessmen whose support would be crucial if he decided to make William's situation a public issue. Porter dismounted with the theatrical flourish of a man accustomed to political stagecraft, his expensive clothing and perfectly groomed appearance designed to project authority and respectability. "William," Porter called out with false heartiness as he approached the main house. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I felt I should check on you after hearing about this morning's excitement." William emerged from the house to greet his uninvited guests, his expression carefully neutral. He had been expecting this visit since Jake Patterson reported seeing Porter's distinctive black carriage heading toward the ranch. "Benjamin, gentlemen, what brings you out in this weather?" "Civic duty, my friend." "Civic duty and genuine concern for your welfare." Porter's smile was as cold as the Wyoming wind. "When federal marshals start investigating prominent citizens of our community, it affects all of us. I thought perhaps we should discuss how to handle this situation before it spirals out of control." The veiled threat was typical of Porter's political style, offering help while simultaneously suggesting that failure to accept his guidance would result in consequences. William had dealt with men like Porter in Chicago and Denver, politicians who saw every crisis as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. "That's thoughtful of you, Benjamin, but I'm not sure what situation you're referring to." The federal agents were here on routine business, nothing that should concern the community. Porter's expression hardened slightly at William's evasive response. "Come now, William. We're all friends here. The entire town knows that you brought a Cherokee woman to your ranch last night, and now federal agents are investigating. Surely you can see how this reflects on our community's relationship with territorial authorities. I see a man helping someone in need during a dangerous storm. If that reflects poorly on our community, then perhaps we need to examine our values more carefully." The subtle rebuke struck Porter like a slap, though he maintained his political composure. "Values are important, William, but so is loyalty to lawful authority. The federal government has made its position clear regarding Cherokee refugees, and defying that position puts all of us at risk." "And what risk would that be, exactly?" William's voice carried a challenge that made Porter's companions shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Economic sanctions, federal investigation of local businesses, military occupation if resistance becomes organized. The government has tools at its disposal that can devastate communities that fail to cooperate with official policy." The threat was no longer veiled, and William felt his temper beginning to rise. Porter was essentially demanding that he abandon Sarah to federal authorities or face coordinated political and economic retaliation. It was the kind of ultimatum that revealed the speaker's true character more clearly than any campaign speech or public declaration. Benjamin, I appreciate your concern, but I make my own decisions about who receives hospitality at my ranch. If that creates problems for you politically, I suggest you focus on issues you can actually control. Porter's mask of false friendship finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating politician beneath. William, you're making a serious mistake. This isn't about personal conscience or individual charity. It's about the stability of our entire region. If you continue harboring Cherokee fugitives, you'll force me to take official action. What kind of official action? William asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The territorial governor is a personal friend of mine, as are several federal officials responsible for Indian affairs. A word from me about your activities could result in a full federal investigation of your business dealings, your land claims, even your personal associations. Is protecting one Cherokee woman really worth risking everything you've built? The ultimatum hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Porter was offering William a choice: abandon Sarah Lightfoot, or face the combined power of territorial and federal authorities, determined to destroy his life and livelihood. It was political extortion of the crudest kind, but William recognized that Porter had the connections and ruthlessness to carry out his threats. I'll consider your advice, William said finally, his tone giving nothing away. Thank you for taking the time to visit. Porter studied William's face, clearly hoping for more definitive commitment to abandon his protection of Sarah. When none came, he remounted his horse with obvious frustration. I hope you make the right choice, William, for all our sakes. As the three men rode away, William felt the weight of the decision he faced settling on his shoulders like a yoke. Porter's threats weren't empty posturing. The councilman had the political connections to make good on his promises of federal retaliation. Continuing to harbor Sarah could indeed result in the destruction of everything William had spent years building, but as he turned back toward the house, he found Sarah watching from an upstairs window, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and guilt that cut through his political calculations like a knife. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand the price of William's protection, and the knowledge was clearly tearing her apart. Inside the house, Margaret O'Brien was preparing afternoon tea with the kind of determined normalcy that suggested she too had heard Porter's threats. That man has the personality of a rattlesnake, she muttered as William entered the kitchen. All venom and no conscience. He's also influential enough to cause serious problems if he decides to make this a public issue, William replied, accepting the cup of coffee Margaret offered. We need to think carefully about our next steps. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but her bearing determined. I heard what Councilman Porter said. I can't let you risk everything for my sake. Maybe it would be better if I surrendered to the federal agents. Absolutely not, William said firmly. Surrendering now wouldn't protect anyone, it would just validate Porter's threats and encourage him to use similar tactics against others. But he's right about the risks. If federal authorities investigate your business dealings, they might find reasons to seize your property or file criminal charges. I've seen how they operate when they want to punish someone. Margaret set down her teacup with enough force to rattle the saucer. Child, what kind of people would we be if we abandoned you the moment helping became inconvenient? Mr. Harrison didn't offer you sanctuary with conditions attached. William found himself studying Sarah's face as she processed Margaret's words. There was something in her expression that suggested she was working through calculations of her own, weighing options that went beyond simple surrender or continued hiding. There might be a third option, Sarah said slowly. Something that could solve several problems at once, but it would require trust and considerable risk. What kind of option? William asked, though something in her tone made him suspect he Wouldn't like the answer. Sarah took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for what she was about to propose. The Cherokee resistance movement I mentioned, it's larger and better organized than federal authorities realize. We have safe houses, communication networks, and resources that could help people like me disappear permanently. But we also have something else, information about federal operations that certain people might find valuable. The implications of her words sent a chill through William's blood. What kind of information? Details about federal corruption, illegal seizures of Cherokee land, systematic violence against tribal members who resist relocation. Evidence that could embarrass powerful officials if it became public. Margaret leaned forward with sudden interest. You're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about justice, Sarah corrected. Federal authorities have been covering up their crimes for years, hiding behind claims of national security and Indian policy. If that evidence became public, it would create enough of a scandal to force them to focus on damage control rather than hunting individual refugees. William felt his pulse quicken as he grasped the audacity of what Sarah was suggesting. Rather than simply hiding from federal persecution, she was proposing to turn the tables by threatening exposure of government corruption. It was brilliant, dangerous, and potentially suicidal. Do you actually have access to this kind of evidence? He asked. Some of it, yes, and I know how to contact people who have more. The question is whether you'd be willing to help me gather and document everything needed to make the threat credible. The proposition represented a complete escalation of William's involvement in Sarah's situation. Helping her hide was one thing, actively working to expose federal corruption was something else entirely. If they failed, the consequences would be far worse than anything Porter had threatened. But as William considered the proposal, he found himself thinking about the broader implications of Sarah's presence in his life. She had already challenged his assumptions about Cherokee resistance, federal policy, and his own moral obligations. Now she was offering him a chance to move beyond passive assistance to active opposition against a system that had proven itself capable of breathtaking cruelty. "What would you need from me?" he asked quietly. Sarah's eyes lit up with hope and determination. "Access to your business contacts, particularly those with connections to newspapers and political figures who might be sympathetic to our cause. Money to fund travel and communication. And most importantly, your reputation as a respected businessman to give credibility to any evidence we present." Margaret looked between them with growing alarm. "This sounds like a good way to get yourselves killed. Federal authorities don't respond well to blackmail, even when it's justified. They respond even worse to continued resistance," Sarah replied. "At least this way, we might be able to protect other Cherokee families from suffering the same fate as mine." William stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had become the backdrop for decisions that would define the rest of his life. Outside, his ranch hands were going about their daily tasks, unaware that their employer was contemplating actions that could transform him from respected businessman to federal fugitive. But something about Sarah's proposal appealed to him on a level deeper than practical calculation. For years, he had built his fortune by working within existing systems, accepting the rules of a game that favored men like him while crushing people like Sarah's family. The opportunity to use his wealth and position to challenge those systems directly was both terrifying and exhilarating. "How long would we have to gather this evidence?" he asked, turning back to face Sarah. "Federal pressure will only increase with time. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly, probably within the next few weeks." William nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Then we better get started. But Sarah, I want your promise that if this becomes too dangerous, you'll accept help escaping to safety rather than pursuing this to the bitter end. Only if you promise the same thing. I won't be responsible for destroying your life in pursuit of justice for my people." As they shook hands on their agreement, Margaret muttered something under her breath about stubborn idealists and impossible causes. But William noticed that she was already clearing the kitchen table, preparing to help them plan what would either be a brilliant stroke against federal oppression or the most spectacular failure in Wyoming territory history. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow across the Circle H ranch, carrying with it the promise of storms yet to come. But inside the warm kitchen, three unlikely allies began plotting a campaign that would test everything they believed about justice, courage, and the price of standing up to power. The game was about to change, and the stakes had never been higher. 3 days after their fateful agreement, the Circle H ranch had been transformed into something resembling a military headquarters. Sarah Lightfoot moved through the house with purpose and efficiency that revealed her true nature as an organizer and strategist rather than a simple refugee. Maps of the Western Territories covered William's study walls, marked with symbols that indicated Cherokee settlements, federal installations, and communication routes that existed completely outside official channels. The first contact had come through a method so ingenious that William found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Native American resistance capabilities. Sarah had positioned herself at specific times near the ranch's windmill, arranging stones in patterns that meant nothing to casual observers, but conveyed complex messages to Cherokee scouts who monitored the area from distant ridgelines. Responding signal smoke plumes that could have been mistaken for campfires, horse tracks that followed seemingly random patterns indicated that her network was not only intact but had been watching the Circle H ranch since her arrival. "Your friend Running Bear will arrive tonight," Sarah informed William as she studied a message decoded from the arrangement of fence posts along the eastern pasture. "He's bringing documents from the Oklahoma Territory incident, plus testimonies from families who witnessed federal agents destroying Cherokee property without legal justification." William looked up from the correspondence he was drafting to newspaper contacts in Denver and Chicago. "How does this communication system work? I've had experienced trackers working for me for years, and none of them noticed anything unusual." Sarah smiled with the first trace of genuine pride he had seen since her arrival. "Cherokee scouts have been evading detection by hostile forces for centuries. Your trackers are looking for obvious signs: broken branches, disturbed earth, clear footprints. We communicate through arrangements that mimic natural patterns or blend with existing ranch operations." The sophistication of the network was beginning to dawn on William as he realized that the Circle H ranch was probably under constant observation by Cherokee scouts, federal agents, and possibly other groups whose interests remained unclear. "How many people know I'm helping you?" "Enough to ensure your safety if federal authorities move against you directly, but not so many that the information could be compromised by capture or torture." The Cherokee resistance learned operational security from military officers who fought in the Civil War, men who understood that secrets are only as safe as the smallest number of people who share them. Margaret entered the study carrying a tray of coffee and sandwiches, her expression reflecting the mixture of fascination and concern that had characterized her attitude toward the unfolding conspiracy. "Begging your pardon, Miss Sarah, but what happens if these federal agents decide to search the ranch more thoroughly? All these papers and maps would be rather difficult to explain." "They're not staying here permanently," Sarah replied, beginning to collect the documents spread across William's desk. "Everything goes to secure hiding places each evening, and if federal agents return unexpectedly, they'll find nothing more suspicious than normal ranch business." William watched Sarah efficiently pack away evidence of their activities, noting the practiced way she handled sensitive materials. "You've done this before organized resistance operations from temporary headquarters in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. The network has safe houses and communication points throughout the territories, but we rarely stay in one place longer than necessary. Your ranch is unusual because it offers both security and legitimacy. Federal agents can't search it easily." without cause, and your business activities provide cover for unusual visitors. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were coming up the main road at a pace that suggested urgency without appearing suspicious to distant observers. Sarah tensed momentarily, then relaxed as she recognized signals that identified the riders as allies rather than threats. Running Bear, just as the message indicated. And he's brought White Hawk and Joseph Thornton. This must be more important than I expected. Joseph Thornton? William asked, recognizing the English name as unusual among Cherokee leaders. Mixed blood, like me. His father was a federal Indian agent who married a Cherokee woman and later resigned his position when he learned what the government was really doing to tribal lands. Joseph has access to federal documents that most Cherokee could never obtain, and federal agents trust him because they assume his white heritage makes him loyal to government interests. The 3 men who entered William's study represented a cross-section of Cherokee resistance that challenged every stereotype he had absorbed from newspaper accounts and political rhetoric. Running Bear was clearly full-blood Cherokee, tall and lean with traditional braids and clothing that marked him as someone who had chosen to maintain tribal customs despite federal pressure to assimilate. White Hawk appeared younger, perhaps in his 30s, with the bearing of a man comfortable in both Cherokee and white society. Joseph Thornton looked like he could have passed for a federal agent himself, well-dressed, clean-shaven, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to moving freely in white society. "Mr. Harrison," Running Bear said in English accented but clear, "Running Moon has told us of your decision to help our people. This is not a choice many white men would make, especially men with much to lose." William stood to shake hands with each of the visitors, noting the way they evaluated him with the careful attention of people whose survival depended on accurate assessment of character. "I believe in keeping my word, and I gave Sarah my promise to help expose federal crimes against the Cherokee people." "Good," Joseph Thornton interjected, opening a leather satchel that contained what appeared to be official documents. "Because what we've brought you will require considerable courage to use effectively." The papers that Thornton spread across William's desk were breathtaking in their implications. Federal correspondence discussing the deliberate falsification of Cherokee land surveys, orders to destroy tribal property regardless of legal ownership, and most damaging of all, authorizations for payments to local officials who cooperated with illegal seizures of Cherokee assets. This correspondence proves that federal agents have been systematically looting Cherokee communities under cover of relocation policy, Thornton explained. Families were told their property would be held in trust while they were moved to reservations, but these documents show the property was actually sold to white settlers at predetermined prices. William studied a particularly damning letter that authorized the sale of Cherokee livestock at prices far below market value, with the proceeds going to federal agents rather than the displaced families. "How did you obtain these documents?" "My position as a translator and liaison gives me access to federal files that other Cherokee never see. I've been copying documents for months, building a case that proves widespread corruption and illegal seizure of tribal assets." White Hawk added his own contribution to the evidence, photographs of burned Cherokee homes and fields that had been destroyed after their owners were removed to reservations. These families were told they could return to their land if they completed the required period of civilizing education on the reservation. But as you can see, there was nothing left for them to return to. Sarah studied the photographs with an expression that mixed rage and grief. "This is what happened to my family's land. The soldiers came with papers that claimed legal authority, but the real purpose was theft disguised as federal policy." The weight of evidence before them was overwhelming, but William understood that possessing proof of federal crimes was only the first step in a complex process. "What's your plan for using this information?" "Simply turning it over to territorial authorities won't help. They're likely complicit in the corruption. Running Bear smiled grimly. We don't plan to use territorial authorities. We plan to use newspapers, politicians in Washington who oppose current Indian policy, and federal judges who aren't controlled by the corruption network. The key, Thornton continued, is simultaneous release of information through multiple channels, making it impossible for federal authorities to suppress the evidence or discredit individual sources. If we can coordinate revelations in Denver, Chicago, New York, and Washington at the same time, the scandal will be too large to contain. William felt his pulse quicken as he grasped the scope of what they were planning. This wasn't just an attempt to protect Sarah or even to help Cherokee refugees. It was a coordinated campaign to expose an entire network of federal corruption that had operated with impunity for years. What do you need from me specifically? Sarah answered before the others could respond. Your business contacts with newspapers and politicians, your reputation as a credible source, and your financial resources to support travel and communication. Costs. Most importantly, we need the Circle H Ranch to serve as coordination headquarters for the next 2 weeks while we finalize preparations. 2 weeks? William asked. Is that enough time to organize something this complex? It has to be. White Hawk replied. Federal pressure on Cherokee communities is increasing daily. More families are being forced onto reservations, more property is being seized, and more resistance leaders are being arrested. If we wait longer, there may not be enough free Cherokee left to benefit from exposing the corruption. Margaret, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, finally spoke up. Begging your pardon, but what happens to all of you if this plan fails? Federal authorities don't strike me as the forgiving type. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Running Bear answered with the calm resignation of someone who had already made peace with potential consequences. If we fail, federal authorities will probably kill us. If we succeed, they'll probably try to kill us anyway. But our families and communities might have a chance at justice. William found himself looking around the study at these 4 people who had committed themselves to a cause that offered little hope of personal survival, but might protect thousands of Cherokee families from continued persecution. The courage required for such a commitment was beyond anything he had ever experienced in his comfortable world of business negotiations and financial risk-taking. Then we better make sure we succeed, he said quietly. What's the first step? Sarah moved to the map of Western Territories, pointing to locations marked with small symbols that represented Cherokee settlements and federal installations. We need to coordinate with resistance cells in 4 different territories, arrange for simultaneous document delivery to newspaper offices in 6 cities, and prepare safe houses for evacuation if federal authorities move against us before we can complete the operation. And, Joseph Thornton added, we need to prepare for the possibility that success will make us permanent enemies of the federal government. Exposing this level of corruption will have consequences that extend far beyond Cherokee affairs. As the 5 conspirators began detailed planning for what would either be a brilliant stroke against federal oppression or a spectacular failure that would cost them everything, William found himself wondering how his life had changed so dramatically in less than a week. 7 days ago, he had been a successful rancher concerned primarily with cattle prices and weather patterns. Now he was planning what amounted to a coordinated attack on federal authority that could result in his death or imprisonment. But as he watched Sarah work with Running Bear, White Hawk, and Joseph Thornton to refine their strategy, he realized that some transformations were worth any risk. For the first time in years, he was part of something larger than personal profit or individual success, something that might actually make a difference in the lives of people who had been systematically crushed by forces beyond their control. Next 2 weeks would test everything he believed about courage, justice, and the price of standing up to power. But tonight, surrounded by allies planning to challenge one of the most ruthless bureaucracies in American history. William Harrison felt more alive than he had in years. The 10th day of their operation brought an unexpected complication that threatened to unravel everything they had built. William Harrison stood in his study at dawn, reading a telegram that had arrived during the night through channels he hadn't known existed until Sarah revealed the extent of Cherokee communication networks. The message was brief but devastating. Federal authorities had arrested 2 Cherokee resistance leaders in Colorado Territory, and under interrogation, one had revealed details about the coordination effort being run from a ranch in Wyoming. Sarah appeared in the doorway as he finished reading, her ability to sense trouble having been honed by months of constant danger. She was dressed in men's clothing borrowed from the ranch hands, practical garments that allowed her to move freely while working alongside William to coordinate their increasingly complex operation. The transformation from the shivering refugee he had found at the train station to this confident, capable woman organizing resistance across multiple territories still amazed him. "Bad news?" she asked, though her expression suggested she had already guessed the answer. William handed her the telegram, watching her face as she absorbed the implications. How much would they know about our specific activities? Enough to make continuing dangerous, but probably not enough to compromise the entire network. Mountain Wolf and Gray Eagle were working independently in Colorado. They knew about the coordination center, but not about the documents or the newspaper strategy. Sarah set the telegram aside and moved to the window, studying the horizon with the habitual caution of someone accustomed to being hunted. But federal agents will be looking for this ranch within days, possibly hours. The practical consequences of the compromise began cascading through William's mind. Federal agents with specific information about Cherokee resistance coordination would have legal justification for conducting a thorough search of the Circle H ranch. The evidence they had so carefully gathered and hidden would be discovered, leading to arrests, prosecutions, and the complete destruction of everything they had worked to achieve. "We need to accelerate the timeline," William said, moving to the map that had become the focal point of their planning. "If federal agents are coming, we have to execute the media campaign immediately, before they can suppress the evidence." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Accelerating means sending incomplete packages to some newspapers, relying on coordinators who haven't had time to establish secure communication with their contacts. The chances of failure increase dramatically, and the chances of federal agents arresting everyone involved increase even more dramatically if we wait," William pointed out. "We always knew this would be a calculated risk." The sound of horses approaching at speed sent both of them to the window. 3 riders were coming up the main road under cover of pre-dawn darkness, but their pace suggested urgent news rather than routine communication. Sarah tensed as she recognized the lead rider, Joseph Thornton, who was supposed to be in Denver coordinating with newspaper contacts there. "Something's gone very wrong," she said quietly. "Joseph wouldn't risk exposure by coming here unless the situation had become critical." Thornton's news, delivered in William's study as Margaret served coffee to men who looked like they hadn't slept in days, confirmed their worst fears while adding complications they hadn't anticipated. Federal authorities weren't just investigating Cherokee resistance, they were implementing a coordinated crackdown designed to crush the entire network before it could expose government corruption. "Military units are moving into position throughout Colorado and Kansas," Thornton reported, his usually calm demeanor strained by exhaustion and stress. "Federal agents have arrested over 30 Cherokee leaders in the past week, and they're offering immunity to anyone who provides information about resistance operations." Running Bear, who had arrived with Thornton, added details that painted an even darker picture. "The arrests aren't random, they're targeting specific people who federal agents couldn't have identified without inside information. Someone with Detailed knowledge of our network has been feeding information to the government. The implications hit William like a physical blow. A coordinated federal response of this scope suggested not just compromise of specific operations, but penetration of Cherokee resistance leadership by federal informants. Everything they had planned, everyone they had contacted, might already be known to their enemies. "How do we know this ranch isn't already compromised?" William asked. "If federal agents have detailed information about resistance coordination, they must know about the headquarters operation." Sarah exchanged glances with Running Bear and Thornton, a silent communication that suggested they had already considered this possibility. "We don't know," she admitted. "But federal agents moving against us here would be complicated by your status as a prominent businessman. Arresting you without overwhelming evidence would create political problems that might outweigh the intelligence value. However," Thornton continued, "that protection won't last long if they find the documents we've been accumulating. Evidence of active conspiracy against federal authority would justify any action they chose to take." William felt the walls closing in around their operation, but rather than despair, he found himself experiencing a strange sense of clarity. The comfortable life he had built at the Circle H Ranch was almost certainly over, regardless of what decisions he made in the next few hours. Federal authorities would never again view him as simply a wealthy rancher pursuing his own interests. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, committed himself to a cause that made him a permanent enemy of the forces that controlled territorial policy. "Then we need to make sure the documents reach their destination before federal agents can stop us," he said, "even if it means taking greater risks than we planned." Sarah studied his face with an intensity that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "William, you understand what you're saying? If we proceed now with federal agents closing in, you'll never be able to return to your old life. Success or failure, you'll be a marked man." The observation hung between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything about their relationship. During the past 10 days, William had watched Sarah transform from refugee to resistance leader, but he was only now beginning to understand his own transformation from businessman to revolutionary. The process had been so gradual that he hadn't recognized the moment when protecting one Cherokee woman had become commitment to challenging the entire system of federal oppression. "My old life ended the night I found you at the train station," he said quietly. "I just didn't realize it until now." The honesty of his statement seemed to surprise Sarah as much as it surprised him. For the first time since her arrival, she looked at him not as a useful ally or generous benefactor, but as a man who had chosen to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal safety. Margaret O'Brien, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Sarah, I hope you'll forgive an old woman for stating the obvious, but all this talk about final commitments and marked men sounds like people saying goodbye." The housekeeper's words forced them to confront the emotional reality that had been building beneath their practical planning. In 10 days of working together to coordinate resistance activities, William and Sarah had developed a partnership that went far beyond the protector-refugee dynamic of their first meeting. But the dangerous circumstances that had brought them together were now threatening to separate them permanently. "Margaret's right," Sarah said, her voice carrying a vulnerability that she rarely allowed others to see. "If we proceed with the accelerated timeline, we'll have to separate for operational security. I'll need to coordinate personally with resistance cells in Oklahoma Territory, while William manages newspaper contacts from here. The chances of both of us surviving federal retaliation, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that their operation had evolved from a calculated risk to what amounted to a suicide mission. Success might expose federal corruption and help Cherokee families, but it would almost certainly cost the lives of everyone involved in the coordination effort. William found himself looking at Sarah with new awareness of everything she represented, not just the cause she had convinced him to support, but the woman who had awakened feelings he hadn't experienced since his youth. The possibility of losing her, just as he was beginning to understand his own emotions, created a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with federal agents or political consequences. "Sarah," he said quietly, ignoring the presence of others in the room, "before we finalize any plans that might separate us permanently, there's something I need to tell you." She met his eyes with an expression that suggested she understood the direction of his thoughts. "William, I love you," he said simply. "I know it's complicated, I know the timing is terrible, and I know we come from different worlds that have been at war with each other for decades. But I love you, and I can't let you walk into mortal danger without knowing that." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Running Bear and Thornton studied their boots with the careful attention of men who understood they were witnessing something private, despite the public setting. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with her apron, her romantic heart touched despite the circumstances. Sarah's response, when it came, carried the weight of everything she had experienced and everything she feared to hope for. "I love you too, William Harrison. I've loved you since the night you chose to help a stranger instead of protecting yourself. But love doesn't change the reality of what we're facing." "No," William agreed, "but it changes why we're facing it. If we're going to risk everything for this cause, let's at least be honest about what we're risking it for. Not just Cherokee families we've never met, but the chance to build something together that wouldn't be possible in a world that allows systematic oppression to continue." The declaration transformed their dangerous mission from a political operation into something far more personal. They weren't just fighting federal corruption, they were fighting for the right to love each other in a world that might finally be worthy of such love. Running Bear cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should consider how this changes our operational planning. Joint survival becomes a higher priority if we're planning a future together." Sarah smiled for the first time in days, her expression carrying a mixture of love and determination that took William's breath away. "Then, we better make sure our plan succeeds. I have no intention of losing the best man I've ever known to federal bullets." As they turned back to the maps and documents that would determine their fate, William felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The comfortable life he had built at the Circle H Ranch was indeed ending, but something far more important was beginning. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would face them with the woman he loved at his side. The next 24 hours would test everything they believed about courage, love, and the price of justice. But for the first time since this dangerous journey began, William Harrison knew exactly why the stakes were worth whatever sacrifices lay ahead. The federal agents arrived at dawn on the 12th day, emerging from the morning mist like phantoms, materialized from William's worst fears. Sarah spotted them first from her position in the ranch house's bell tower, where she had been maintaining watch since the previous evening. 23 riders in military formation, led by a man whose bearing screamed federal authority even at a distance of half a mile. They moved with the confidence of hunters who knew their quarry was trapped. "William." Sarah's voice carried urgency without panic as she descended from the tower. "Federal agents, military escort, approaching from the east. We have perhaps 10 minutes before they reach the main house." The final phase of their plan had been designed for exactly this contingency. But the reality of federal forces actually surrounding the Circle H Ranch sent adrenaline coursing through William's veins in ways that no amount of preparation could have prevented. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, would be decided in the next hour. Margaret O'Brien moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for days, activating hiding places that had been constructed with meticulous attention to detail. Documents disappeared into specially constructed wall cavities. Evidence packages were sealed and lowered into root cellars. and the study was transformed from resistance headquarters back into the simple office of a cattle rancher. But their most important preparations had nothing to do with hiding evidence. Running Bear and Joseph Thornton had departed the previous evening, carrying copies of the most damaging documents to contact points throughout the Western Territories. If federal agents arrested everyone at the Circle H Ranch, the exposure operation would continue without them. Success no longer depended on their personal survival. "Sarah," William said as he watched her make final adjustments to their preparations, "remember our agreement. If this goes badly, your primary obligation is to survive and continue the work. Don't try to protect me at the cost of everything we've accomplished." She paused in her activities long enough to meet his eyes, with an expression that mixed love and stubborn determination in equal measure. "And you remember our agreement as well. We face this together, or we don't face it at all." The sound of horses entering the main yard announced that their time for preparation had ended. William straightened his clothing and walked to the front door with the bearing of a man, greeting expected business associates rather than potential captors. Sarah positioned herself in the kitchen, where she could observe the confrontation while remaining hidden from immediate view. The man who dismounted and approached the house was exactly what William had expected from Sarah's descriptions of federal Indian agents, middle-aged, expensively dressed, and carrying himself with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to absolute authority over the lives of others. His pale blue eyes swept over the ranch buildings with the calculating gaze of an appraiser evaluating property for seizure. "Mr. Harrison, I presume?" The agent's voice carried the clipped tones of Eastern education, combined with the hardness of someone who had spent years enforcing unpopular policies through intimidation and violence. "I'm Special Agent Matthews from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We need to discuss some serious matters regarding your recent activities." William stepped onto the porch, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well in business negotiations with far more reasonable adversaries. "Agent Matthews, welcome to the Circle H Ranch. I'm afraid I'm not sure what activities you're referring to." Matthews smiled with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Mr. Harrison, let's not waste time with elaborate pretenses. We know you've been harboring Cherokee fugitives. We know you've been coordinating resistance activities. And we know you've been gathering evidence with the intent to interfere with federal Indian policy." The directness of the accusation confirmed William's suspicion that their security had been compromised at levels they hadn't anticipated. Federal agents didn't arrive with 23 armed men based on rumors and speculation. Someone with detailed knowledge of their operation had provided specific intelligence about activities at the Circle H Ranch. "Agent Matthews, those are serious accusations. I hope you have evidence to support them, because false accusations against law-abiding citizens tend to create political complications that extend beyond territorial jurisdiction." The subtle threat that William might have political connections of his own seemed to amuse Matthews rather than concern him. "Mr. Harrison, I represent federal authority in matters of Indian affairs. Territorial politics and local connections are irrelevant when national security is involved." "National security?" William allowed skepticism to color his voice. "That's an interesting way to describe whatever brings federal agents to a cattle ranch in the middle of winter." Matthews gestured toward his men, and William noticed several of them dismounting and positioning themselves to surround the house. The choreography was too practiced to be improvised. These agents had conducted similar operations before, probably many times. Cherokee resistance to federal relocation policy has become a significant threat to territorial stability. When wealthy ranchers begin providing sanctuary and coordination support to Cherokee fugitives, that resistance gains resources and legitimacy that pose direct challenges to federal authority. The admission was more honest than William had expected, revealing that federal concern extended beyond simple law enforcement to political control over territorial development. Men like William represented a class of wealthy settlers whose cooperation was essential for implementing federal policies that local populations might otherwise resist. Agent Matthews, I'm still not clear about what specific violations you believe have occurred on my property. Are you here to conduct a search based on federal warrants, or are you simply hoping I'll confess to unspecified crimes? Matthews reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document that he handed to William with obvious satisfaction. This is a federal warrant authorizing comprehensive search of your property for evidence of conspiracy against United States Indian policy, harboring federal fugitives, and interfering with lawful federal operations. William scanned the warrant with the attention to detail that years of business contracts had ingrained in his thinking. The document appeared legitimate, signed by a federal judge in Denver, and specifying search authority that extended to all buildings, equipment, and personnel on Circle H Ranch property. But as he read the warrant's specific language, William noticed something that sent a chill through his blood. The document authorized search for evidence of crimes that had allegedly occurred over the past 6 months, including dates that preceded Sarah's arrival by several weeks. Federal agents weren't just investigating his recent activities. They were conducting a comprehensive investigation designed to uncover any connection he might have had to Cherokee resistance activities. This warrant suggests you believe I've been involved in Cherokee resistance for months before recent events. That's an interesting theory, Agent Matthews. What evidence supports such an expansive investigation? Matthews stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that carried unmistakable menace. Mr. Harrison, your ranch has been under federal surveillance for longer than you might imagine. Financial transactions, travel patterns, business associations. We've been building a comprehensive picture of your activities and connections. The revelation that the Circle H Ranch had been under federal surveillance for months explained how agents had responded so quickly to Sarah's presence. It also suggested that William's decision to help her had been seen by federal authorities as confirmation of pre-existing resistance sympathies rather than an impulsive act of compassion. In that case, William said carefully, your investigation should have revealed that my activities have been limited to legitimate business operations and normal hospitality toward travelers in need. Normal hospitality doesn't typically involve Cherokee resistance leaders, clandestine communication networks, and coordination of multi-territorial opposition to federal policy. Matthews smiled again, clearly enjoying the revelation of how much federal agents knew about their operation. The specific details that Matthews possessed confirmed William's worst fears about security breaches within Cherokee resistance networks. Federal agents didn't just know about Sarah's presence at the ranch. They knew about Running Bear, Joseph Thornton, and probably every aspect of the coordination effort, from her concealed position in the kitchen. Sarah listened to the conversation with growing awareness that their situation was far worse than they had anticipated. Federal agents hadn't just discovered their operation. They had been monitoring it from the beginning, allowing it to develop while gathering evidence and identifying participants throughout the network. The sound of movement throughout the house announced that Matthews' men had begun their search without waiting for the conclusion of negotiations. Sarah could hear boots on the stairs leading to the second floor, voices in the study where their maps and documents had been hidden, and the systematic destruction that accompanied thorough federal searches. But the hiding places that Margaret had designed were proving their worth. Sarah could hear agents searching areas where evidence had been concealed, but their voices carried frustration rather than satisfaction. The most damaging documents remained hidden, at least for the moment. Matthews continued his interrogation of William with the patience of someone who knew that time favored federal authority. Mr. Harrison, we're going to find the evidence we need, and we're going to arrest everyone involved in this conspiracy. Your choice is whether to cooperate voluntarily and potentially reduce the consequences you face, or continue this pretense until we complete our investigation. William understood that he was being offered a chance to betray Sarah and the Cherokee resistance in exchange for federal leniency. The proposal was exactly what he had expected, and exactly what he had prepared himself to refuse. Agent Matthews, I appreciate your offer of cooperation, but I'm afraid I can't help you with an investigation based on false premises. If you find evidence of actual crimes on my property, we can discuss the matter further. Until then, I'll exercise my right to remain silent. The formal invocation of his legal rights seemed to amuse Matthews. Mr. Harrison, you're not under arrest yet. These are simply questions about suspicious activities that have been observed on your property. Surely a law-abiding citizen would want to help federal agents understand those activities. The trap was elegantly constructed, designed to encourage William to provide information that could be used against him while maintaining the fiction that he was cooperating voluntarily rather than being interrogated as a suspect. But William had learned enough about federal tactics from Sarah and her allies to recognize the technique. Agent Matthews, I think I'll wait for my attorney before discussing anything further. These questions seem to have moved beyond simple curiosity about ranch operations. Matthews' expression hardened as he realized that William wasn't going to be intimidated into providing information or confessions. Very well, Mr. Harrison. We'll continue our investigation and let the evidence speak for itself. A shout from inside the house announced that the systematic search had finally yielded results. One of Matthews' agents appeared in the doorway carrying a leather portfolio that Sarah recognized as one of their document packages. Sir, we found this hidden in a wall cavity in the study. It contains correspondence between federal agents and local officials regarding Cherokee land seizures, plus photographs of destroyed Cherokee property. Matthews opened the portfolio with obvious satisfaction, scanning documents that represented weeks of careful gathering and analysis. Mr. Harrison, these materials constitute clear evidence of conspiracy to interfere with federal Indian policy. I think our conversation just became significantly more serious. As federal agents prepared to make arrests that would destroy everything they had worked to accomplish, Sarah realized that their only remaining hope lay in a contingency plan so dangerous that they had hoped never to use it. But with William about to be arrested and their evidence falling into federal hands, desperate measures had become their only option. The endgame was about to begin, and everything they had fought for hung in the balance. The signal came as Agent Matthews prepared to place shackles on William's wrists, a distinctive whistle that echoed across the ranch yard with the piercing clarity of a hawk's cry. Sarah recognized it immediately as the Cherokee call for escape now. But what followed defied every expectation about how desperate situations could transform into miraculous reversals of fortune. The first indication that their contingency plan was working came from the eastern ridge, where smoke began rising in patterns that spelled out messages in Cherokee signaling code. Then came answering signals from the north, south, and west, great plumes of smoke that announced the Cherokee resistance network wasn't just alive but was implementing the most audacious rescue operation in territorial history. Agent Matthews paused in his arrest procedures as his men began pointing toward the surrounding hills with growing alarm. Sir, we're receiving reports of large groups of riders converging on this location from multiple directions. The federal agent's confident demeanor began to crack as he realized that his carefully planned raid was about to become something far more complicated. Through field glasses, his scouts could see Cherokee warriors moving with military precision across terrain they knew better than any federal map could indicate. But these weren't the desperate refugees that government propaganda had portrayed. These were organized fighters, implementing a coordinated strategy that suggested months of preparation. How many? Matthews demanded, his voice tight with the first hints of genuine concern. At least 60 riders from the east, maybe 40 from the north, and more appearing on the southern ridges. Sir, I think we're about to be surrounded. Sarah emerged from the kitchen at that moment, no longer concealing her presence but standing openly beside William with the bearing of someone who had just revealed the true scope of Cherokee resistance capabilities. "Agent Matthews, I believe. You're about to learn why the Cherokee Nation has survived 3 centuries of warfare against superior forces." The transformation in her demeanor was complete gone, was any pretense of being a helpless refugee seeking sanctuary. This was Running Moon, Cherokee resistance leader, revealing herself as the architect of everything that was about to unfold. "You planned this," Matthews said, his face flushing with rage as he grasped the magnitude of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. "This entire operation was a trap." "Not a trap," Sarah corrected. "A rescue, and a demonstration that Cherokee resistance has capabilities your intelligence networks never suspected." The sound of approaching hoofbeats was now clearly audible from multiple directions as Cherokee riders closed the distance to the ranch house. But what appeared through the morning haze wasn't a ragtag collection of desperate fugitives. It was a well-equipped force moving with the discipline and coordination of a professional military unit. Running Bear appeared at the head of the eastern column, carrying a staff that bore eagle feathers and traditional Cherokee war symbols. Behind him rode men and women whose bearing announced that they were warriors in the truest sense, people who had chosen to fight rather than submit to forced relocation, regardless of the consequences. "Agent Matthews," Running Bear called out. As his column halted just outside rifle range, "You are surrounded by Cherokee forces numbering over 200 fighters. We demand the immediate release of William Harrison and all evidence seized from his property." Matthews looked around at his 23 men, calculating odds that had shifted dramatically in the past few minutes. Federal agents were trained for intimidating individual families and conducting searches with minimal resistance, not for military confrontations with organized Cherokee forces that outnumbered them 10-1. "This is armed rebellion against federal authority," Matthews shouted back. "Any attack on federal agents will be considered an act of war against the United States government. The United States government declared war on the Cherokee Nation when it began stealing our land and murdering our families," Running Bear replied. "We're simply choosing to fight back instead of dying quietly." Joseph Thornton appeared from the northern approach, but he wasn't alone. Riding beside him were 3 men whose expensive clothing and obvious wealth marked them as powerful figures from outside the Cherokee community. Sarah smiled with grim satisfaction as she recognized the final element of their plan coming into position. "Agent Matthews," one of the newcomers called out, "I'm Senator Harrison Douglas from Colorado Territory. I believe we need to discuss this situation before it escalates into something that will embarrass the federal government." The appearance of a territorial senator complicated Matthews' position immensely. Federal agents could justify almost any action against Cherokee resistance, but political figures with connections to Washington required more delicate handling. Douglas had clearly been brought here for specific purposes that went beyond simple rescue operations. "Senator, this is a federal law enforcement operation involving fugitives from justice and conspiracy against Indian policy. I don't believe territorial jurisdiction applies in this situation." Douglas dismounted and approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with federal bureaucrats from a position of political strength. "Agent Matthews, I think you'll find that territorial jurisdiction applies very directly to the situation, particularly when federal agents are operating based on falsified evidence and corrupted intelligence." The senator opened a leather document case and withdrew papers that he handed to Matthews with obvious satisfaction. "These are affidavits from federal judges in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Cheyenne stating that the warrants used for this operation were obtained through perjured testimony and fabricated evidence." Matthews scanned the documents with growing alarm, recognizing official seals and signatures that carried considerable legal weight. "These allegations are preposterous. Federal warrants are issued based on comprehensive investigation and verified intelligence. Actually, Douglas continued, federal warrants in this case were issued based on testimony from Cherokee informants, who were coerced through torture and threats against their families. We have medical evidence, witness statements, and sworn affidavits documenting systematic abuse of Cherokee prisoners to obtain false confessions. The revelation sent shockwaves through the federal agents as they realized that their entire operation might be legally compromised. Warrants obtained through illegal coercion could be invalidated by territorial courts, making any evidence seized during the raid inadmissible in federal prosecution. But Sarah's contingency plan included elements that went far beyond legal challenges to federal authority. Even as Senator Douglas negotiated with Matthews over warrant validity, Cherokee riders were implementing the most crucial phase of their operation. White Hawk appeared from the western approach carrying saddlebags that contained the final pieces of evidence they had been gathering for weeks. But instead of hiding this evidence from federal agents, he was preparing to deliver it directly to the newspaper reporters who had been positioned throughout the territory in anticipation of this moment. "Agent Matthews," White Hawk announced, "while you've been conducting your raid on this ranch, Cherokee riders have been delivering documented proof of federal corruption to newspaper offices in Denver, Chicago, New York, and Washington. By this evening, every major newspaper in America will be printing evidence of systematic theft of Cherokee property by federal agents and territorial officials." The scope of the Cherokee operation was finally becoming clear to Matthews and his men. The raid on the Circle H Ranch hadn't been the culmination of federal investigation. It had been the trigger for a coordinated media campaign that would expose government corruption on a national scale. "The documents you've seized here," Sarah added, "are copies of evidence that's already in the hands of journalists, federal judges, and congressional investigators. Arresting us won't stop the story, it will just provide additional evidence of federal attempts to suppress legitimate investigation of government crimes." Matthews stared at the Cherokee forces surrounding his position. The territorial senator whose political connections could destroy federal careers, and the evidence packages that were already beyond his reach. For the first time in his career, as a federal agent, he found himself facing a situation where intimidation and violence couldn't solve his problems. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice carrying the bitter taste of defeat. "We want justice," Running Bear replied. "Justice for Cherokee families whose land was stolen, whose property was destroyed, whose children were taken to government schools and never seen again. We want the truth about federal Indian policy to reach the American people so they can decide whether this is being done in their name. And," Sarah added, stepping forward to take William's hand, "we want the right to live free from government persecution, to build lives based on love and respect rather than fear and oppression." The personal dimension of the confrontation finally crystallized for everyone present. This wasn't just about Cherokee resistance or federal corruption. It was about two people who had found love in the midst of systematic injustice and were demanding the right to build a future together. Matthews looked between the Cherokee forces, the territorial officials, and the couple whose relationship had somehow become the catalyst for exposing an entire network of government crimes. His authority as a federal agent meant nothing in the face of political pressure, media attention, and military forces that outnumbered his own men by overwhelming margins. "I'll need to consult with my superiors about how to proceed," he said. "Finally, of course," Senator Douglas replied diplomatically, "but I suggest you proceed carefully. The territorial government has documentation proving systematic corruption within federal Indian policy, and we're prepared to pursue congressional investigation if this situation isn't resolved appropriately." As federal agents began withdrawing, under Cherokee escort, William felt Sarah's hand tighten in his with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. The impossible had somehow occurred. Their desperate gamble had not only succeeded, but had created momentum for challenging federal Indian policy throughout the Western Territories. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked quietly as they watched Matthews and his men disappearing into the distance under Cherokee guard. "The immediate crisis is over," Running Bear answered. "But the larger struggle for Cherokee freedom will continue for years. What you've accomplished here has given our people hope and resources they've never had before." William looked around at the Cherokee warriors who had risked everything to rescue strangers, the territorial officials who had chosen justice over political convenience, and the woman whose courage had inspired them all to become better than they had imagined possible. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah smiled with the radiant joy of someone who had survived the impossible and found love in the process. "Now we build the life we've been fighting for. The Cherokee resistance will continue, but it will do so with legitimacy and support it's never had before. And we," she squeezed his hand, "will build something beautiful together." 6 months later, William Harrison and Sarah Lightfoot were married in a ceremony that brought together Cherokee traditions and territorial customs in ways that had never been attempted before. The wedding was attended by Cherokee leaders, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and federal judges who had been convinced by evidence of government corruption to support Cherokee rights. Their marriage became a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, justice over convenience, and courage over comfort. The Circle H Ranch was transformed into a model of cooperation between Cherokee families and territorial settlers, proving that different cultures could work together when treated with equal respect and dignity. The newspaper campaign that had been triggered by their desperate gamble continued to expose federal corruption for years, leading to congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and fundamental changes in Indian policy throughout the Western Territories. Cherokee families were given legal title to land they had occupied for generations. Government schools were reformed to respect tribal languages and customs, and federal agents who had committed crimes against Cherokee communities were prosecuted under territorial law. But for William and Sarah, the greatest victory was the simple joy of building a life together without fear, surrounded by friends who had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by love and justice. Their story became legend throughout the territories, the millionaire rancher and the Cherokee resistance leader whose love had changed history. And on quiet evenings at the Circle H Ranch, as they watched the sunset paint the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and crimson, William and Sarah would remember the winter night when a chance encounter at a train station had set in motion events that proved love could indeed conquer all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.